Warhammer 40k is just as expansive on the tabletop as it is in the lore. Players wage grand battles against each other with their curated armies and various missions to see who comes out on top. It's a pretty big spectacle, even in smaller games. While I've covered a bit of tabletop stuff on this channel, I've never gotten into how to actually play the game itself. So today we're going to get into the trenches on how a game of Warhammer 40k actually flows. We're going to look at round progression, basic mechanics such as moving, shooting, saving throws, etc., and how to read data cards. This is going to be a bit different than my other videos, as there's not going to be a ton of images like usual, but mostly some visual examples of play and relevant data card info. There's a lot to cover, so let's get into it. Welcome back to Starhammer. 40k tabletop lasts 5 battle rounds, with 1 turn per player per round. After everyone deploys their armies and rolls to see who's attacking and defending, or who's going first and second, at the beginning of each turn, each player generates a CP, or command point, before things kick off. Each turn is broken down into 5 steps, called phases. Command phase, movement phase, shooting phase, charge phase, fight phase. In your command phase, you'll generate a CP, and you'll take care of any triggers that might be resolved here. A CP, or a command point, is a little point that you can use on stratagems. These are things that give you buffs, let you re-roll, things like that, and they're dependent on the armies, so you should be able to check those pretty easily in the app or on Warhammer. Usually any kind of triggers or stratagems are limited to specific character units or phases. Still, some stratagems and army detachment rules are resolved here, such as the Thousand Suns Kindred Sorcery Detachment ability, which lets you pick an army-wide bonus at the top of each of your command phases. You'll also roll your Battle Shock test for units that have suffered significant losses after resolving all other rules. I'll explain Battle Shock a bit more later. Command phase is pretty straightforward. You've got a couple of rules to resolve, and this is where defenders score their objective points. Keep in mind that you can't score off main objectives in the first round, but secondaries, as described in your mission rules, are fair game. The reason for this is that some units can deploy right in the midfield with the infiltrator keyword and essentially would be able to just farm points right off the bat, and that player would have an unfair advantage. But before we go any further, we gotta learn how to read data cards, because they contain all the info we're gonna need going forward. For this example, we're gonna use one of my all-time favorite units, the Emperor's Champion of the Black Templars chapter. The order of values at the top of the card from left to right is as follows: movement, or how far this model or models can move; toughness, their resistance to attacks; save, the value they need to meet or beat in order to avoid taking damage; wounds, how much health they have; leadership, the number they need to meet or beat to not be battle shocked; and objective control. The higher the number, the higher chance they will control an objective over your opponent. Your movement phase is pretty self-explanatory. Here, you move your unit in accordance with the move characteristic denoted on their data card under the M value. For the Emperor's Champion, that's 6 inches. So we'll move him 6 inches closer to this enemy sorcerer, measuring from the base. With monster or vehicle units, you can measure from any given point on the model. You can move all your units in this phase or none at all. Sometimes, it's beneficial not to move. Why? Well, some weapons have the heavy keyword. This means that if models using that weapon stay stationary that turn, they get to add 1 to their ballistic skill, which is how good they are at shooting, but we'll get to that next. After you finish moving everybody around, there's an optional substep in movement called reserves. They're brought in during the end of your movement phase in the reinforcements step. Reinforcements are units you didn't deploy on the board during your deployment step for one reason or another. Maybe they're aircraft, maybe they have deep strike, whatever. These units have specific rules as to when and where they can enter, usually denoted on their datasheet, but generally speaking, they all follow a couple general rules. Aircraft, for instance, can only come in at the second battle round at the earliest, unless they can hover, and like every other reserve unit, it has to come wholly within 6 inches of a board edge, and not within the enemy DZ, or deployment zone, and wholly within 9 inches of any enemy models. From turn 3 onward, you can deploy units in the enemy DZ, but the distance to the board edge and model still stands, and reserves can only come in at round 2 and onward anyway. After deploying a unit from reserves, that unit counts as having made a normal move that turn, but can otherwise shoot, charge, act normally. There are a few exceptions to these rules that are noted on specific unit cards, but we won't worry about that today. As with any phase, there are sometimes extra unit rules that need to be resolved at some point in it. Take the Knight Abominate's Warp Storm's ability. This states that at the end of your movement phase, roll a d6 for each enemy unit within 9 inches of this model. On 3 up, those units suffer d3 mortal wounds. Sometimes, you might need to move through or over a piece of terrain. If the terrain piece in question is 2 inches or shorter in height, you don't need to do anything. Just move through it as if it wasn't there. If it's taller than that, you're gonna have to subtract that height from your move characteristic, such as when climbing down from a building, for example. Just remember, models can't end a move within engagement range of, be set up in, or advance or fall back into the engagement range of other models. We'll get to why in a second. Once that's all said and done, we can move on to the fun shit in the shooting phase. The shooting phase is pretty easy peasy. You take a look at the ranged weapons you have equipped, and you shoot. For our Emperor's Champion, he's got a bolt pistol to shoot this enemy with. So we're going to declare all our shooting attacks from this unit to that unit. Remember, you must declare all your attacks before you make them with any unit. So, if you're using a squad with multiple ranged weapons or a vehicle and want to split fire, though I don't recommend you do so, you need to declare those targets with those guns before you start shooting. So the first thing we have to consider is range. EC has to be at least 12 inches from his target in order to make the shot. We measure it and see he's within range, so we can make that attack. Next on the card we have A, which stands for attacks. This is how many attacks a unit can make with that weapon. In this case, 1. Next we've got BS for ballistic skill. This is how well your model can shoot. EC is pretty cool, so he lands on a shot of 2 up. So when we roll, we gotta meet or beat a 2 on the die. And we did it, but simply landing a shot isn't enough. Now we gotta roll to see if your shot actually goes through their armor. That's where S for strength comes into play. And this is where it gets a little weird. For our bolt pistol, it's strength 4. We compare this to the enemy's toughness, which is also 4. When determining if an attack wounds the target, we use the following method. When an attack and strength are both the same value like they are here, we need to roll a 4 or better to wound. When an attack is more than the toughness but not twice as much, we have to roll a 3 or better. If it's twice as much as the toughness, we have to roll a 2 or better. When the toughness is higher than the strength, it's the reverse. So if it's better than our strength, say a 5, then we need to roll a 5 or better to wound. But if the toughness is twice as good as our strength, so in this case it would have to be 8, we would need a 6 to wound. We roll the dice and we got a 4, so our shot goes through. The defender now has to make a saving throw to see if they actually take any damage. For the Exalted Sorcerer here, that's a 2 up. At this point, you'll note any AP or armor piercing your weapon has because that affects that person's save. Our bolt pistol doesn't have any AP, but what if it did? If it did have AP, let's say AP -1, that means your opponent subtracts 1 from their save. So then, the sorcerer would have to roll a 3 up not to take damage. If they fail their save, the shot takes a number of wounds off the model or unit equal to its damage characteristic, or D, in this case, 1.
Hey, Editing Colin here. Just letting you know that when it comes to saving throws, there's a little thing called an invulnerable save that some units have. EC has a 4 up invuln save, meaning that it can't be affected by armor piercing or anything like that. So if you get something that makes your save higher than it should be, or that you can't make a save, if you have an invulnerable save, you can use that instead.
Now, AP can be modified or downright negated by using cover. Cover is usually categorized as a piece of terrain your models can hide behind but are still somewhat visible. Line of sight is literal, so if they can see you, they can shoot you. When you're within the footprint of a terrain feature like a ruin or behind a sandbag within an inch that partially covers your model, you count as having the benefit of cover. Provided that you're getting hit with AP and you don't have a 3 up save, because at that point, you're just too cool for that benefit. Anyway, if any of your normal units get shot at with AP while in cover, say AP -2, that would generally make your save 2 worse. But with cover, you get to save yourself from it a little bit by negating AP by 1. So you'd only have to worry about your save being 1 worse instead. During a shooting phase, you may have weapon keywords or abilities to keep in mind as well, such as the heavy bonus I mentioned earlier. You'll see keywords noted under the weapon name on your sheet. Any abilities will be under the abilities section, which will tell you what to do. Always be sure to look for these, especially if you're a new player or using a new unit. It's very easy to forget them in the middle of combat. Important to note, weapons with the torrent keyword, like a flamer, auto hit the target, but you still gotta roll to wound. Most of them ignore cover too. I also want to show you how allocating damage to a unit of models works. It's more or less the same, except you get to determine what model takes the heat. For example, if this squad of dudes takes 3 wounds, and each model has 2 wounds apiece, I get to allocate the damage to any given model. Someone's gonna die either way, so we put that over on this guy. And then we have 1 left over we can allocate to another guy. So this guy's gonna be a 1. I like to use some dice to note that so I won't forget. It's also important to note that when a unit takes damage, it must first be allocated to the model that's already taken some. So remember that next time these guys take some shots. When it comes to rolling attacks for a squad, there are 2 ways you can do this. The official method is rolling each attack for each model 1 at a time. So for these Hellblasters, that's rolling 2 attacks for each guy here individually. Ain't nobody got time for that. Instead, I and literally every other player on the planet use a method known as speed rolling. Essentially, if all the attacks for a unit are coming from the same gun, just roll them all at once. With Hellblasters, they're all using plasma incinerators with 2 attacks each. So I'm gonna roll 8 dice for 8 total attacks with my 4-man squad. Speeds the game up a lot and is just generally easier to do, but if you're just starting out, it might be best to take things slow. So, We get done shooting the stuff we want to shoot, and now we're moving on to our charge phase. This is how all your units get into engagement range, or melee range, of enemy units. Making a charge is pretty simple. You declare what units are charging what, one at a time, and measure the distance between your model and the models you'd like to charge. So in this case, we need a 6 or better to make the charge. We roll 2d6, and we get an 8. So that's more than enough to get us where we need to be. Small caveat: character units attached to squads can't be targeted by any attacks unless it has the precision keyword. That applies in melee and in shooting. Resolve any rolls you might need to, such as the Brutalis Dreadnought's ability, which lets you do more rolls on the charge, and we're ready to move on to the fight phase. Fighting can be a little weird, but don't worry, I'll break it down for you. When a unit charges, they have priority for attacking. If you've played D&D or Cyberpunk before, imagine them being higher on the initiative order. When nobody is charged, the defender always goes first. There are a few exceptions, but generally that's how things go. Anyway, resolving attacks works just like shooting, except this time you're using your melee weapons. Most of the time, you'll just have one block, but with units like EC, you got choices on what kind of melee attack you'd like to make. You can only pick one. Once you've made your choice, resolve your attacks just like you would when shooting. But what about when attacking with a whole squad? Well, that's where things can get a little weird. In order to engage in melee, models must be base to base, or as close as reasonably possible. Some models are spiky or have odd angles that might prevent base to base contact. Obviously, the guys at this dude's butt can swing on him. But what about their friends back there? Models that are base to base with another model that are base to base with the enemy model get the chance to swing as well. But in order to increase your odds of damage, you can do a pile-in move at the start of the fight phase. It's such a moving your squad up to 3 inches closer to that nearest enemy model, so you can squeeze in a few more hits. Once everyone swings, the defender fights back. Now we move on to the next fight until all the fights are resolved. Then we end the phase, start it all over again. Okay, I know that was a lot to digest, but wait, there's more! Now I'm going to start getting into some of the extras. So just a few more things to note. When a unit gets destroyed, any remaining attacks that are made against it fall off. If a bodyguard unit for a character is destroyed, the remaining attacks flow onto the character. So we do all that, our enemy takes their turn, and they mess up one of our units pretty badly. Our 5-man squad from earlier now only has 2 guys left. Well, in our command phase, we'll have to roll a battle shock test. To do that, we roll 2d6 and compare the results to our LD, or leadership value, on our stat block. For these guys, that's 6. So we need to roll a 6 or better on our roll. If we get that, nothing happens, and it's business as usual. If we don't get that unit is now considered battle shocked. This means we can't use cool stratagems on that unit, and their OC goes to 0, so they can't control objectives.
Hey, it's me again. Forgot to mention that in Battle Shock, you only have to do that if your unit is below half strength.
If they fall back from engagement range at this point, which we'll talk about that move in a second, they must make a desperate escape test. This means we roll a d6 for each model in that unit, and on a 1, we lose a model. Falling back is a move you can make in your movement phase with a currently engaged unit. If a unit isn't battle shocked and enemies aren't dogpiling you, you can move your unit out of engagement range to maybe stop them from getting chewed up on your opponent's turn. Just be careful in doing so, as that enemy unit can now shoot at you with their real guns and not just pistols, as well as charge you to regain engagement. But this can come in handy. You can move your units into cover, negating AP from ranged attacks, which you don't get the benefit of cover in melee, and you force them to re-roll a charge roll, which they could always fail, leaving them totally open to attacks on your turn. It's also important to note that while within engagement range, you can't shoot or be shot at unless you're a monster or vehicle, which would make the shooter and targeter take a -1 to hit. Pistols are also an exception and are the only weapon by infantry that can be fired in melee. Blast weapons are also off limits for obvious reasons. Advancing is another thing you can do in your movement phase. With advancing, you roll a d6 and add that to your movement, and that's how much you can move. But just like falling back, once you do that, you're done unless the rules state otherwise, such as with weapons that have the assault keyword or the Black Templar's Castellan ability. You heard it right. When you fall back or advance, you can't shoot or charge unless your rules say otherwise. Now you're probably saying,
"But Colin, how do I score? How do I win?"
Scoring is determined based on mission rules and secondary objectives. This can vary depending on the mission, but it'll usually go something like this. You have 3 dudes on an objective with 2 OC apiece. Math is hard, but in this case, we can add those numbers up and see that we have 6 OC on that objective. Provided we're within 3 inches of that objective, we can secure it and then control it when our turn rolls around. What happens if our enemies are on the same point? Well, whoever has the most OC will end up controlling that point. If you both have the same, it's considered contested and nobody can score. Secondary objectives are other things you can do to gain extra points. One of those is called Bring It Down. With this objective, you get points by killing monsters and vehicles determined by the wounds value your target had. These allow you to eke out a win if it's a close game, or the opportunity to catch up if you're lagging behind. Again, scoring changes slightly depending on what you're playing, and I'm just speaking very generally so that you have an idea of how shit works. And I think that'll do it for this one. I know that was a metric fuck ton of information, but I'm just scratching the surface on how complex some of these rules and rulings can get. And GW really isn't the most clear about how they write their rules sometimes. Every casual group might also have some house rules as well, so just be sure to talk things out with your crew before you get into the game to save some time. For example, I'm usually playing with 2 other people, and there's no rules for a 3-person 40k game. So, we made our own score structure to keep things easy. 5 points for objectives, 3 for characters and vehicles, and 1 for regular units, with all scored at the beginning of our turns. Anyway, if you're new and watching this, I know this can be a lot, but I hope my poorly produced visual aids helped. I also want you to know that it does become a lot easier when you actually get to do all this shit yourself on the tabletop. It's not as scary in person, I promise. Welcome to the hobby and welcome to the channel. I hope you stick around. For you veteran players, let me know how I did and if I missed anything and how I can improve. I try to give them a straightforward rundown of things, but let me know in the comments if there's something that threw you off and just what you thought about in general. As always, I love hearing from you guys. Drop a like if you like it, a subscribe if you really liked it. Don't forget to check out the community tab for shitposts and shenanigans. Links to the social and other goodies are in the description down below, and I'll see you all in the next one. Toodles.